completely catch up by the end of this week, and so if you're looking at the syllabus, we'll be at the end of week 6, which is what this week is. I hope by Friday, January 15th. In fact, I'm reasonably certain, because I've thought about what portions need more attention and what text and what subjects need less attention. All right. Now, and as this agenda indicates, what I want to do is I want to begin today's lecture with a few concluding remarks about the Congo, the colonization of Africa, and the question of scientific racism. All right. And then move from there to Tagore and Okakura very briefly. The question of nation and nationalism is something that we've addressed before, but we want to now look at a turn of the century nationalism, because there are various ways in which what was transpiring in India and Japan at the turn of the century points to somewhat different trajectories than what we had seen in the 19th century. And then I want to pave the way for my discussion, which will be in a more concentrated form in the next lecture, on Lenin and the Great Bolshevik Revolution. There are actually 3 revolutions in Russia, by the way. I mean, most people think of only one revolution, but there's a revolution in 1905. Then there's one in February of 1917, which is the Petrograd Revolution, and then, of course, the Great October Revolution, or otherwise known as the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, which brings the Lenin and the Communist Party into power. And that will be really the centerpiece, along with a discussion of colonial wars in my next lecture. And then finally, on Friday, January the 15th, we're going to move to the whole question of World War I, the Ottoman Empire, its demise, what was the Ottoman Empire, and what we might call, for the sake of convenience, successor states that come into shape, and the implications of World War I. So basically, this week will take us into the second and third decades of the 20th century. Now recall that in my concluding remarks to you, I'd been speaking to you about Congo, the Congo Free State, and Leopold's fiefdom, that this is his personal fiefdom. The state is formed in 1882. And before I'd gotten into the whole subject of the Congo Free State, we had looked at the Berlin Conference, and the whole carving up of Africa by various European powers. And I had spoken to you about what I described as a regime of terror, which was based on the question of extraction of rubber, and of course the other mainstay of the trade, the European trade there, was ivory. And in 1908, the rule of Leopold II is brought to an end. That's not because he dies, but simply because he had become an extraordinary embarrassment, which is really a very mild word considering that under his jurisdiction, a mass-scale genocide had been taking place in the Congo between 1885 and 1908, where, as I had pointed out to you, about 8 to 10 million natives, are killed. So now the Congo actually becomes a Belgian colony, and directly a Belgian colony. It's going to be ruled directly by Belgium, and of course it's not going to be until decades later that Congo is then going to achieve its freedom. And this is the slide with which I had ended my discussion on Friday. Amputated figures. One of the things that I want to mention to you, of course, is which is really a subject for a lecture unto itself, and there was a little bit of that, for those of you who are really seeing attentively, there was a little bit of that in the exhibition at the Fowler Museum, which is photography, right? The introduction of photography in the mid-19th century. So if you look at places such as, one of the things that distinguishes the American Civil War from, let's say, the wars of extermination against American Indians conducted by Andrew Jackson, which, it's a difference of only 20 to 22 years, but one of the big differences between the two is that the wars of extermination conducted by President Andrew Jackson, you don't have any photography at that time. In Civil War, you have photography. Just like in the Indian Rebellion of 1857-58, photography has already come into place. And then, of course, we have to understand how do we actually interpret a photograph. And I would suggest to you very briefly that you need to take the same view that I had suggested that you take of something like the census, because recall my remarks about the census, that the census is not simply an apparatus of governance which captures the reality out there. Right? Now, that is a typical view that in fact what I had mentioned to you was that the census actually creates in part that social reality it purports to actually capture and document. Right? And of course, we have to understand the various ways in which photography does exactly the same thing, that it doesn't simply capture the reality. I mean, that's again the most common assumption behind a photograph. And then there are other assumptions such as a photograph is worth 1,000 words, etc., etc. But those are common sense ways in which we think of a photograph. And of course, you all know, and one reason you know that is because of some things like Photoshop today, that you can manipulate photographs. But it was always possible to manipulate photographs. It's not Photoshop that invented the manipulation of photographs. So how photographs are deployed, how the camera focuses, the conception of the gaze behind the camera, how it decides to exclude or include, all of these are very significant considerations. And of course, one of the things is when you see this, and you have to say, well, is this being used by, who is this being used by, this photograph? Think of it this way. Right? Is it being used by those who are anti-colonial activists who are trying to suggest that this is what happens to native people under colonial rule? Right? Or is it being used by Leopold and his agents to frighten, intimidate, terrorize a population that if you don't do what you're supposed to do, this is the likely outcome for you? At best, because of course 8 to 10 million people are killed. Right? That's a very simple illustration that the same photograph could obviously be read by two different parties as having two very different kinds of meanings. All right? And what is significant is that all of these genocides, and this is going to be certainly true of the Holocaust. I mean, one reason why the Holocaust has the kind of place in the imagination that it does is because the enormous amount of photographic documentation as well. It's not simply the death count, right? The death toll here is higher over a period of 20 years. And you're talking about the elimination of half the population, right? But it's also that by the 1920s, 30s, 40s, photography is even more sophisticated now, right? And then the particular way in which concentration camp survivors and those who were killed are going to be captured is going to itself become a subject of considerable scholarly investigation. But this was also the era. So there are different kinds of explosion of print media as well. You know, I had spoken about pamphlets to you before, but here what you see is you see cartooning, right? So this is a cartoon that is published in The Punch, which is an English magazine. And The Punch has the most famous cartoons for its generation. It was undoubtedly the most famous magazine in the English-speaking world for cartoons, just as The New Yorker would be for a later generation. All right, and this one is it's called In the Rubber Coils. The cartoonist is a man called Linley Sambord, and he depicts. So here, this is King Leopold II, and he is shown in the form of a snake who has coiled himself around a rubber collector, right? So of course the suggestion here is that Leopold is a snake. He's devious and so forth and so on, but that you can't get out of the trap in which he has placed you, right? And this cartoon we had seen before, but what I hadn't shown you before. So this is of course the Rhodes Colossus, where Rhodes is standing astride all of Africa. The whole concept of Cape to Cairo, Cape Town to Cairo, all of Africa is a white man's domain. But look at this one here. You can see that this cartoon was really modeled after that one. And this one is called Colossus of the Pacific. And it's published in the Chicago Tribune, where you have Uncle Sam, that is, of course, the United States, standing astride over U.S. possessions in the Pacific, right? So cartoonists, of course, cartoons are now proliferating, and cartoonists obviously are learning from each other as well. But my story, before I get to the last subject for this segment of scientific racism, my story of the colonization of Africa would not be complete without at least a few very brief words about the fact that there was guerrilla warfare that was waged in African territories, in African possessions that had come into territories that had come into colonial possession. And one of the most famous of these guerrilla warfares, this is not in the Congo, this is more in West Africa, in the savanna lands of West Africa from 1882 to 1898, is the resistance that was forged by this man, Samory Toure, who lives from 1830 to 1900. He's finally captured. I mean, he evades capture for 16 years, and he conducts guerrilla warfare. And when I say guerrilla warfare, what I mean is precisely what the term indicates, that you conduct these lightning raids, moving around in small bands and then go and hide in various places. It becomes difficult for large armies to try to actually capture guerrilla forces. And one of the reasons why they had to resort to this was precisely because of that asymmetrical warfare that I'd spoken to you about before. Remember that the French forces, the British forces, they're all using the Maxim gun. They're using, versions of the Gatling, and there's really no competition here at this point in time. 20 years later, the new element that will really aggravate this asymmetrical warfare is bombing by the air. But at this point, it doesn't exist. But by the end of the second decade of the 20th century, this will become the new form of introducing asymmetrical warfare. So this man is finally captured in 1898, and he's exiled into the Gabon, and then he dies here in 1900. But really, what the main consideration here is the question of scientific racism. And let me explain to you what I mean here by scientific racism. I don't mean that there's any scientific basis from my standpoint of the whole consideration of race. What does it mean to speak about a race of people? All right. Is there such a thing as a pure race? Of course, the whole ideology of National Socialism in Germany, beginning in the 1930s, early 1930s, and obviously until the end of war, was very much predicated on that. But one of the things that this book that was given to you, Exterminate All the Brutes, is trying to establish is that its history is much earlier. It's much earlier, right? And in fact, we can even go back, although he doesn't really do that, we can really go back to the 18th century, and I'm going to revert to this in later on in my lecture today, when I'm going to speak about what we understand of something called Russia and Eastern Europe, because in some ways there was a huge amount of racism there as well, right? And how Western Europe thought of Eastern Europe, right? The question for you to consider there will be, well, where does Western Europe begin and where does it end? Where does Eastern Europe begin and where does it end, right? Where do we actually draw the line? How do we know that a place is part of Eastern Europe or Western Europe? When does this distinction between Western Europe and Eastern Europe really arise, right? Now, the point here simply is that the idea of racism, twofold. One, that the idea of racism is not the same as the idea of prejudices. There's obviously an overlap of the two. Because I think, as a simple proposition, I would submit to you that the notion of prejudice is something that's been around forever, so to speak. All right? There have always been people who have had certain prejudices about others. I mean, if you go back to, let's say, for example, the 6th century BCE, right? And for those of you who have ever read a book by Herodotus called the Histories, or if you've heard of Herodotus, he's a Greek writer, And one of the things he's doing here, he's talking about, for example, the Egyptians. And from his point of view, the Egyptians were, you might say, half human, half animal. All right? And so then when you read Herodotus and when he's describing various other people who are not part of the Greek world, and if you were not part of the Greek world, what were you? You were a barbarian. Because if you didn't speak Greek, it sounded like ba, 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 so to speak. All right? You're basically a barbarian. So is that the same as racism? Should we then say racism existed in the 6th century BCE? And the answer is no. And why is the answer no? Because we can speak of prejudices that have been around for a long period of time. But racism is a way of instantiating these prejudices in a scientific worldview. The supposition was that there's actually a science behind the distribution of the races and how we understand these races and their relative position in the universe, right? And then this scientific racism became one of the central ideological planks of colonialism, right? Racism of this kind did the intellectual work. There were other things that did the intellectual work of colonialism too, but this was one of the things that did the intellectual work. And here what I have here is 3 quotations. So one is from Robert Knox. I mean, all of these quotations are taken from Exterminate All the Brutes, where he says, and you have to remember, by the way, these are all exceedingly respectable intellectuals, scholars, academics. Right? I mean, they would be working in institutions in 1850, 1880, 1898, 1900, which are the equivalent of major research institutions in the West today. Right? We're not speaking about some outliers. This is not some rumor published in National Enquirer, right? Your tabloid, that you can buy at Ralph's or Vaughn's or whatever. We're talking about people who are purporting to offer you a scientific account of why is it that some races prosper and other races decline. So what does he say? Race is everything. Literature, science, art, in a word, civilization depend on it. Can the dark races become civilized? I should say not, says Robert Knox. The Saxon race will never tolerate them, never amalgamate, never be at peace. It is a war of extermination. Right? This is, of course, that view. So this is social Darwinism here. This is a view that, it's a law of the jungle out there, and some people will prevail and others won't. And, of course, the white people will prevail because we're genetically superior to everyone else. Right? Have we done with the Hottentots and Bosnian race? I suppose so. They will soon form merely natural curiosities. Now, for those of you who came to my lecture, to the Fowler, and then my lecture subsequently on Saturday, and you recall what I told you about museums, well, that's where these people belong. That's what he's saying, right? They will soon form merely natural curiosities. It's like a stuffed animal, right? That's all that really is left for them to do. Already there is a skin of one stuffed in England, another in Paris, if I mistake not. In a word, they are fast disappearing from the face of the earth. And this is not a lamentation. This is not an expression, it really distresses me, the fact that there are people who are disappearing from the face of the earth who are very different from us. No, this is a matter of rejoicing, and now at least we'll have a few new museums where we can stuff these people. And then Alexander Thiel, a lecturer in German at Glasgow in Scotland. Right? And, I've picked these quotations deliberately because I also want to disabuse you of a notion that is very prevalent in Anglo-Saxon America. Namely that, this is a problem of the German Teutonic people. No. Robert Knox, people like that, they are speaking for an Anglo world view. There is really no difference between the English, the Germans, the French. So if you read Lindquist, the Central African expedition that he describes over there, there is no difference. Don't fall into the game of trying to distinguish between good imperialists and bad imperialists. you know, because they all represent the same worldview. And what does he say? Writing in a book called Vox Diens, Service to the People, 1891. Just one small quotation. All historical rights are invalid against the rights of the stronger. You know, you read Thucydides, History of the Peloponnesian War, the war between Athens and Sparta, 4th century BCE, and the Mytilenean debate. It's replaying that exact debate. You know, that there is only one law, and it's the law of the powerful. And let's not get sentimental about the rights of darker races, American Indians, so forth and so on. And then, of course, finally, Paul Rohrbach, German Thought in the World. So I've given you a spread as well, 1850 to 1912. You're talking about 62 years. And of course, one of the things that Lindquist is trying to establish, a point that I will reinforce when we get to the Holocaust in a week or two from now, a couple of weeks from now, is that, again, the Holocaust is not that exceptional thing that it has been made out to be. Yes, it's an extraordinarily gruesome set of affairs. But what did the Holocaust do, as Lindquist is trying to argue, using this whole account of racism? What it did was it brought that brutality which the colonial powers had visited upon the people of Africa and Asia. It brought that brutality back into Europe itself. Right? Back into Europe itself. So this was his way of understanding, Lindquist's way of trying to understand the links between colonialism and something called the Holocaust. All right? Now, the period we're looking at, late 19th century, early 20th century, is also a period of the rise of nationalism. Now, we have seen nationalism before, and there's this tricky question that I've spoken about before. What is the relationship between nation, nationalism? Which, you know, there are very sophisticated theorists who fall on two sides of the divide here. By which I mean that there are those who say that, well, nationalism precedes the nation. All right, nationalism actually creates the nation. And then there are those who take the view that nations engage in something called nationalism. And you could, and you know, this is a classic chicken and egg kind of problem. But what you might also want to think about is introducing that third term which we have introduced in our discussions, in my lectures, and namely the nation state. Because you could say, of course, that one way to think about this is to take the view that you need some sense of the nation, you need to have a nation, you need to have some notion of a people who share something in common, whatever that may be. Recall that long discussion by Renan, trying to understand what that thing may be that is in common. Is it language? Is it some kind of notion of common history? Is it some notion of blood? Or some notion of the soul of the nation? But you may need that first, right? And then that gives the impulse to something called nationalism. And that nationalism then leads to the production of something called the nation state. Right? But of course, we know that it doesn't work only in that way, because, for example, one can speak of, let's say, people in the American political establishment who are nationalists, right? I mean, I think that I think no one will deny the fact, and this is a fairly neutral observation in that sense, that Donald Trump is a nationalist. But this nationalism that he embraces doesn't, it's not, the end is not the production of a nation state. You already have a nation state. So there may be forms of nationalism which are meant to reinforce the nation state or make us change the configurations in our imagination of what the nation state is. Right? So there are different ways to understand it. What is important for our purposes is that turn of the century, nationalism now becomes a potent force in places such as India and Japan and China. China, we're going to turn to in a more extensive discussion because we're going to have to look at the emergence of the Chinese Communist Party and Mao and all of that, right? But if we, for a moment, briefly turn our attention to India and Japan, we have an interesting set of questions that emerge for the first time. Before I discuss what these questions are, let me just take you back to India for a moment. So 1857, 1858 was the Great Rebellion, and at the end of that rebellion, the East India Company ceases to exist, and India now becomes a crown colony. And the 1857-58 rebellion had been crushed with extraordinary ferocity. So there was brutality on both sides. Now, after 1858, when India becomes a crown colony, for the first couple of decades, the English are going to be engaged in a project of trying to bring some semblance of what they call progress. Right? In other words, the country has gone through a great deal of turmoil, and so now the idea is let's try to introduce some semblance of progress, law and order, restore some notion of harmony, do things that will make our rule attractive to the Indians. And so one of the things that you see is you see the growth of higher education. A number of universities are going to be founded, beginning in 1857 itself actually, and then moving into the second half of the 19th century. There are going to be various initiatives in social reform. However, the Indians are going to say to themselves two things. And when I say these two things, you can imagine that in many countries which are colonized, people are asking the same question. One fundamental question that every Indian is asking himself or herself, every Indian that is who was a thinking person in some sense of the term, was, what is it that made us vulnerable to colonial rule? I mean, after all, it's the Indians who are being ruled by the English. It's not the English who are being ruled by the Indians, right? It's going to be the Africans who are going to be ruled by the English and the French, and the Belgians and Germans, and Indonesia is going to be ruled by the Dutch, etc., etc. So the question that many Indians, highly educated Indians in particular, are asking themselves is, what made us vulnerable? Is there something in our character that is weak? Does the West represent a higher form of civilization? If we did become vulnerable, if we became colonized, how did that happen? And of course, secondly, that's the second question now, as you move into the 1870s, 1880s, and thereafter, many Indians are saying, what part do we have in the governance of our own country? So how did the English rule India? Right? So I had given you a fairly elaborate account of that for the first half of the 19th century. But in the second half of the 19th century, to give you one illustration of how they ruled India, they had a civil services. It's called the ICS, Indian Civil Services. Right? So the equivalent of that would be in the United States being a bureaucrat working for the State Department, for example, or the Secretary of, the Interior or Homeland Security, among those who are civil servants, right? And you know that civil servants are supposed to be apolitical. It doesn't matter who's the president, which party is in power. If you're a professional civil servant, you're a bureaucrat, and you're supposed to execute the functions of the particular department or ministry to which you belong. Now, the Indian civil service in the 1870s did not have a single Indian. They were all English men. Of course, all men, no women. And many of them were exceedingly young. Some of the English who were officers of the Indian civil service were men in their early 20s, mid-20s, who had just come out from England a few years ago. They didn't know any Indian language. And a person might be placed in charge of a district with 1 million people, and he's supposed to govern them with an iron hand. Right? So by the 1880s, many Indians are saying, well, what role do we have? in governing ourselves. And so in 1885, an organization is going to be founded called the Indian National Congress. The Indian National Congress is going to become the largest nationalist organization in the world. It is also going to become a model for many nationalist organizations. Very good example, ANC, African National Congress, the same organization of which was led by Nelson Mandela, right? And which still exists, by the way, in South Africa. Many countries are going to have an organization of that kind. This is going to be an organization of nationalists. Now, in its early years, the Indian National Congress was really a very small organization comprised of highly educated elites. I mean, at its first meeting, there were only about 80 or 100 people. And at that point, they're not agitating for independence from Britain at all, not even remotely. What they're saying is, you know, we're highly educated Indians. How come we don't have some say in what happens in our country? Right? So they're going to petition the British government that we should be allowed to take the Indian Civil Services exam. By the way, to take the Indian Civil Services exam, you had to take it in London. Right? So so eventually when they're going to open up the Indian Civil Services to the Indians, the Indian has to go to London to sit for the exam. How many people in India can afford to go to London at that point in time? Think of it. Right? So you get all these anomalies. That's too much detail for me to get into at this moment, but you understand some of the paradoxes involved here and what the demands are. So they're going to basically submit these petitions. And if I may put it this way, just to take a rough date, 1900, many of these educated Indians are going to come around to the view that petitioning the British is not going to do any good. What you're also going to have is you're now going to begin to have mass politics. So you're going to have Indian masses who are going to start to enter into the public domain. And then what we're going to see when we turn to Gandhi much later on, a few weeks from now, we're going to see the transformation of the Indian National Congress from an elite organization to what becomes a mass organization, which at one point, by 1920, had more members than any other organization in the world, including the Chinese Communist Party. Right? It was that large. Right? But that's the beginnings of nationalism, is this sentiment that we want to be a part of the nation, we want to be able to take some part in governing ourselves effectively. And two of the people that I want to look at very briefly are Rabindranath Tagore and Kakuzo Okakura. Now, one of the respects in which nationalism at this point in time is different in this part of the world is there is also this idea of an Asian civilization. And this is a very complicated idea. A very complicated idea. Because you have to ask yourself, well, what is it that makes the people of India, China, Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Japan, right? And there are other countries that I've omitted from that list. What is it that makes us all have something in common? Is there something? If there is some conception of an Asian civilization, what could it be? And here's the problem, that when Asian intellectuals such as Okakura, so I've given the dates for both Okakura and Tagore, and I've picked, in some respects, the supreme example from both India and Japan. That is, people who were extremely widely known in their own country. Tagore was a revered figure. But people who also were widely known in the West as well. And these were people who were extremely fluent in English. And they could therefore move across cultures with absolute ease in some respects. In fact, Okakura, who is well known as a kind of a Japanese nationalist as well, wrote all his books in English. Unlike Tagore, who wrote mainly in Bengali, but also wrote extensively in English. I mean, his corpus of works is so huge that it's almost 2,000 songs, 10 novels, hundreds of essays. He's the first Asian to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913. And when he wins the Nobel Prize for Literature, at that point, I can tell you, if you read accounts of Tagore, he is lionized in the West. I mean, there wasn't an educated person who hadn't heard of him. He was that well known. His decline was also very sharp. Within 10 years, he'd been completely forgotten. And now in recent years, again, he has been revived in various ways. But one thing that was common to both Okakura and Tagore, so they're both people who can mediate between their culture and the West. They move very fluently in number of universes. You know, someone like Okakura, for example, lived in India, he lived in China, Japan, Europe, the United States. So he's able to translate, as it were, into all of these different environments. All right? But one thing that is common to both of them is that even though they are nationalists in some sense, Okakura more so than Tagore, and I'll come to the difference between the two as well in just a moment, they are both, and I'm using this word for the sake of convenience, they are also both internationalists, and both of them are advocates of this idea that there is something called an Asian civilization. And this is where we run into the problem. Here's the rub, which is that how does that make them different from those European writers, the Orientalists, who for 100 years had been arguing that there's a fundamental difference between the West and the East? And what is the difference? The fundamental difference was articulated as a difference between materialism and spiritualism, that the West is materialist, the East is spiritualist. Right? That in the West, there is a greater concern with the externalities of life, with the material forms of culture, which is why the West is very good at setting up organizations, at introducing notions of administrative efficiency, at making things work. In the East, there is a tendency to become inward, not insular, inward. You retreat within yourself. You think about the colossal questions of life. Those colossal questions are, well, what is my purpose in being in this world? What is the nature of existence? Is there something more to life than getting up every morning, brushing my teeth, you know, and doing all these mundane things, and then bagging groceries at Ralph's for 30 years of my life? Right? Is there something more? What is the purpose of human existence? Right? How does one become liberated? Those are the colossal questions. And so the argument was that in the East, there is some tendency to gravitate in that direction. And the East meant, again, all of India, China, Japan, Asia as a whole. Of course, in the Western view, there was a hierarchy here. That, yes, it's very nice to think about spiritual matters and so forth and so on, but it doesn't really get you much purchase on life. It's not going to really help you move along. Apart from all of these spiritual preachers we have these days who have massive churches, you know, which seat 40,000 people and mega billion-dollar empires. You know, there are Christian evangelical preachers with billion-dollar empires. So they, you know, they have found very good ways to marry materialism and spiritualism, I can tell you. And that's not particular only to them. There are Hindu gurus who are exceedingly good at that as well. But you see that there is still that split. There's still that split. So what's happening here are two different things. One is this idea of an ancient civilization, and what does Okakura say? Right? So this excerpt I gave you from a book called The Ideals of the East, 1904. He says, Asia is one. And the minute I see that, I pause and say to myself, see, if I'm an educated Indian, and I'm living in India at that time in 1900, I would say this is even true of the educated Indian today. In fact, maybe even more true today. The educated Indian sitting in Delhi or Bombay or Calcutta does not think Asia is one, by the way, at all. Because the educated Indian knows a lot more about the West than the educated Indian knows about China or Japan. And every family I know from the upper middle class, middle to upper middle class, a strata that I know, all their children who are finishing school or who have finished school, who wanted to go to college, they know exactly what you have to do to get into Harvard, UCLA, Berkeley, Princeton, and many of them head here. They don't have the remotest interest in China, Japan, Korea, Indonesia, any of that. But then we say, well, what does Okakura mean? Unless we're going to simply say, well, he's wrong, which is not the case as such, because what he's trying to suggest is that there is some ways in which Asia is fundamentally different, some ways in which there is a kind of a unity. What might that unity be? For example, the links that were forged between India and China over a long period of time. How did Buddhism travel? Right? It traveled from India to China, to Japan, so forth and so on. So Asia is one. The Himalayas divide only to accentuate two mighty civilizations. The Chinese with its communism of Confucius. Communism here is being used in the proper meaning of that term, which is some notion of communal feeling. Right? He's saying that that's what is fostered under Confucius. And the Indian with its individualism of the Vedas. Right? That all of Asia is either Sinic, that is, that it came under Chinese influence, or it's Indic, it came under Indian influence. And that was one of the things that links all of that vast expanse from the point of view of somebody like Okakura. Right? But not even the snowy barriers can interrupt for one moment that broad expanse of love for the ultimate and universal, which is the common thought inheritance of every Asiatic race. Right? Now you can see that this is what is common to every Asian, is the love of the universal, that the Asian has within herself or himself this idea of distinguishing between what is permanent in life and what is peripheral, what is transient. Right? But, and here's the second element. So first, notion of Asian unity. Second, however, is the fact that Okakura also thought of Japan as the first among equals. And that's where I use the Latin phrase, primus inter pares, the first among equals. That, yes, you have India, you have China, you have Japan. These are three great civilizations. But Japan is the first among these equals. Because he saw it as Japan's mission. Now, this is 1904, this book. This is just before Japan was going to inflict a crushing defeat on Russia, the great Russo-Japanese War of 1905. You know, right? So he's writing just before that, but he is thinking to himself that Japan has a special mission. Its mission is to be the leader of this pan-Asian civilization that he's thinking about. So this is the emergence of what is called pan-Asianism. This notion that all the Asian people really forge a certain common worldview. All right? And what he's going to do in his writings is he's going to distinguish between what he calls a nation of the West and the spirit of the West. And the distinction really is this, that he also understands at the same time, because this is not a knee-jerk reaction to the West. He's not saying the West has to be condemned entirely. He's saying there's something admirable about the West. Something in the energy of the people, of the English and the French. What made them go out all over the world? What made them introduce various forms of technology? What made them introduce superior forms of social organization of life? You know, in India, I always say there is an ironclad law of organizations in India today. I don't know a single organization that has lasted really more than 50 years. I mean, at some point they all crumble. That's, you know, and it doesn't have to do with the climate, let me assure you. You know, there's this pet theory that everybody has that you can explain everything. You know, a hot tropical country is very hard to work. You get enervated all the time. Singapore is hot, humid. Of course, it's also an air-conditioned nightmare or air-conditioned pleasure dome, depending on how you look at it. Everything is air-conditioned. If they could air-condition the exterior, they would do that, right? But they managed to build the most prosperous society in the world. And by the way, you can measure how a country is by the passport index. I don't know if you've ever heard of something called the passport index, which is the best passport to have in the world. That is, you can travel anywhere and not have any worries about whether you're going to be allowed, whether you need a visa, you know. And what do you think is the best passport in the world? Singapore, not the US. US is number 17 on that passport index, you know. Right? So it's not the climate. Let's be sure about that. We don't want to use some kind of, you know, climactic determinism here and determine that that's what really. But he's saying there's something that the English, the French represented, right? But it was that same thing which, in its perverse form, leads these colonial countries to perpetrate the most extraordinary, catastrophic genocides in the world. That's what he was concerned about, because when Tagore is writing, he's seeing the emergence of Japan, but he's also worried, because he's worried that the Japanese, he says, have their own spirit, they have their own aesthetics, they have their own culture. Will they be true to this, or will they get swallowed up by the West? And of course, when he died in 1941, this was before, he died before the attack on Pearl Harbor, but of course he didn't have to wait for that, because in 1937 and the 1930s, the Japanese military empire was already fully in shape. They had already taken over large parts of China. You have all heard about the rape of Nanking, as it's called, right? The Japanese incursions into Manchuria, all of that. So he had the answer that Japan had really gone the way of the West. It had taken some of the best elements, and then it had perverted them exactly in the way in which the West had, you know, right? And this leads to the final question there that I want you to think about in this segment. And that question has to do with what is transferable and what is not in a culture. Let me just take 2 minutes to have you think about that, because, you know, my modus operandi, I like to leave you with some kind of provocation of a different kind. See, I think that when we look at cultures, if you look at, for example, the question of democracy today, you know that all the American wars of the last 20 years, they were all claiming, the Americans were claiming they were going to bring democracy to Iraq, they were going to bring democracy to Libya, to Afghanistan. Now there are those who say, well, these countries can never be democracies. You know, they just don't have that spirit. I don't accept that at all. I don't accept that, because that same argument was advanced apropos of a country like India, for example. Now, these people will never learn to govern themselves. But what is interesting is to think about what is transferable in a culture and what is not. So if you take something like Coca Cola, right, or what is portable and what is not. Coca Cola is the same in the 195 countries of the world. Whether you drink it here or in Sudan, well, yes, I know the water may be just a tad bit different, right? But Coca Cola is basically Coca Cola. Whether you drink it, as I said, here or in Sudan or India or Afghanistan or Berlin. Then you take, so in other words, Coca Cola is portable. It's something that comes out of here, it's portable. You can send it off. There are some forms of culture which are intermediately portable. The novel is a genre of literature which originated in the West, in Europe. And every country and every language adapted the novel. In India, in Bengal, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee writes novels in Bengali by the last quarter of the 19th century, by the 1880s. And it's very recognizable as a novel. But they adapt it, they change it. It's not quite the same. It's not quite the same. And then there are some things that are not portable in a culture. I think if I had to pick one thing that is not portable from Western culture, It is Western opera, not Western classical music. Because the Chinese and the Japanese and the Koreans, they all love, the great pianists, Mozart, Chopin,